You are tuning in to the Pop Culture Retrospective Podcast.
This show is dedicated to the memory of my big sister Rebecca, a fan of all things pop culture, particularly of the people, places, and things that defined the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Welcome aboard this pop culture time machine. I'm Amy Lewis. You are tuning in to episode number 90, revisiting 90s TV shows with very special guest, author and pop culture aficionado, Mr. Chris Morgan. Enjoy. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into the Pop Culture Retrospective Podcast. This afternoon, I am excited because I am joined by Mr. Chris Morgan, who is an author. He is a trivia host and a nostalgia lover. And Chris has written a few books. I think there's two especially that would be of really great interest to listeners of this show. The first one being the Nickelodeon 90s cartoons, game shows, and a whole bunch of slime, which I'm definitely going to be checking out. I've done a couple of episodes on Nickelodeon, and we'll do some in the future. So I think that would be a great reference point. And his most recent work, which is going to be coming out very soon, is another book entitled 99 Episodes That Defined the 90s, Television Milestones from Arsenio to Homer to yada, yada, yada. And if you grew up in the 80s or 90s, you'll know exactly what he's referencing there. So Chris, thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here talking about, obviously having written, two books in this realm,
Yes.
Pop culture of this era is right up my alley. And I appreciate the opportunity to, talk about my book, but of course, just talk about whatever is related to the culture of the milieu of this podcast.
Yes.
It's not all just about promoting my book. I also just wanted to have like a nice conversation or what have you. So yeah. I'm looking forward to seeing how this shakes out.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. Well, I think it's a win-win for everybody when people like you can be on the show. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself if people are maybe not familiar with your writings and what you do?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, just, first I'll just say that because, my name is fairly common. So I'll say I'm not the Chris Morgan that writes the Fast and Furious movies, unfortunately. If that's what you're tuning in, be like, oh, I want to hear what the dude who wrote Hobbs vs. Shaw has to say. I do occasionally get, on the social media, somebody, hitting me up, wondering if I'm that Chris Morgan. Also, on that realm, and I'm completely off on a sidetrack about my nomenclature as opposed to what I do. But when there was briefly that dude on social media, that the bagel boss or whatever that got memed, his name was apparently Chris Morgan, and so there's a little bit of that too. Where people are like, oh, I'm like, no, I'm not that guy either, but I am a writer, a culture writer. I started using that phrase more because it's kind of like a succinct way of describing what I do, because I've written professionally now for many years about TV and movies and sports and music, food. I worked for a German skateboarding magazine. I wrote in English, but like, so I've done a lot of stuff. Like I'm a culture vulture type.
Cool.
And now, probably 90s pop culture, 90s TV's kind of become my bailiwick, particularly in books, because when you're working in the book space, having a sort of like an easy like pitch, like a thing to be like, I write books about 90s TV, like I'm a 90s culture sort of guy. It's, it makes it easier when you're going to a publisher to be like, this is what I do. So I do that. I do also host a trivia, as you noted. I've done some improv. I've done some stand-up gigs, that I've gotten a little money for here and there. But yeah, mostly what I do is writing about pop culture, and I've been doing that for a lot of years. And now I've had a few books come out, being able to do that. And as you said, my most recent, my upcoming book, as of the time of this recording, and probably by the time it's being listened to this podcast, though the book is available for pre-order, is about television episodes that can be used to sort of discuss what the 90s as a concept, as both a time frame, but also a cultural idea, which is, something that surely, I'm not the first person to bring up the notion of the 90s as a cultural conceit as much as a span of calendar from January 1st, 1990 to December 31st, 1999.
Sure.
And sort of what the book is, focused on, and what a
Yeah.
lot of my work these days is focused on.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, like I said, I think that book, the topic is certainly going to be up people's alley. And we're going to be talking a lot about 90s TV here in just a moment. And if any long-term listeners of the show will know that that's been a huge emphasis of the shows. I've discussed a ton of sitcoms and dramas and all sorts of facets of the 1990s. But before we get into that, my first sort of question I like to ask people is, when did you know that pop culture and writing were going to play an important role in your life?
Oh, interesting. Well, I mean, I was, I'm of an age and of an era when screen time, the concept, you hear parents of this era talk about as like limiting screen time or what have you. I was, raised by television, and not in a bad way. I don't say that in a negative way. I loved it. I loved watching television and sitting in front of the TV. And while, I've, led to this level of work, it's like my brother and my sister, sort of the same thing. My brother, got a PhD in biochemistry from MIT. So being raised by television suited him just fine as well. But yeah, I always really enjoyed TV, and I would watch, Nickelodeon into Nick at Night, and, watch all these old shows. Oddly, like my favorite show when I was 6 was Dragnet. The Jack Webb, show about hippies being evil. I realize now, and not so much at the time. It's just like a cool sort of like procedural with all this Los Angeles mystery to it. As somebody who grew up in like Michigan, is like this world, this interesting world, and everything like that. But in terms of it, like being like, so I always loved TV and I always loved movies. I got my college degree is in film studies. And then I also, I enjoyed writing, but what I envisioned for myself, for my goal coming out of college, was to be a TV writer. And I did go to Los Angeles and, worked on the periphery of the television world for a while there. But I was finding work related to writing, was starting to arrive through the means in which I do it now, where I write about stuff, and I enjoy that just as much. And then, that became how I turned writing into, my profession, and being able to, and knowing what I know about TV and movies and having an interest in that, it sort of was an easy realm to find myself working in. But TV and movies have always been, a big part of what I was interested in from the time I was a young child. And I still enjoy the pop culture and the films and the TV. And, writing is pretty much the only thing I've ever done for a living, since my college days. And, I still enjoy it. And fortunately, it's something that doesn't really have with AI, maybe it does have a shelf life on it, but in theory, I could do it, for the rest of my life.
Yes, let's hope so. Yes.
Unless the computers start taking away from me, and then who knows what I'll do. But until that day, until Skynet comes and starts writing books about 90s TV, that's what I'm doing.
Right. Well, and hopefully, AI does not take over, because certainly one thing I really appreciated about your book was that you really incorporated a lot of sort of reminiscing about watching certain things, and a computer can't do that. Computer is not nostalgic, so we'll keep our fingers crossed. So in your new book, you talk about a who's who list of 90s TV shows. And can you tell us a little bit about what your process was for that? How you decided what TV shows to utilize and in which episodes to utilize?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So that's like the first thing I did once I had the idea, was like, because that part of the pitch of the book was, I had to have like sort of like my table of contents available. I knew every chapter was going to be about a TV show. First it's like, I want to do, first it's going to be 90 episodes that define the 90s. And at the time I was like, will shows have multiple episodes. I wasn't sure, but I realized pretty quickly when I was going through it, I was gonna be able to do one episode per show, and then I'd be covering all these different shows. Then it was just a matter of finding the episode, and some of them came to mind like immediately. Some of them I was going through the episode lists. So it's not just about like picking the best episode. It'd be about picking the episode that could be used to discuss something related to 90s culture. Sometimes, I was able to double dip a little bit. For example, like in my Fresh Prince of Bel-Air chapter, I wrote about the episode where they go beyond Oprah, because it's also an opportunity to talk about Oprah as a cultural figure without having an Oprah, chapter per se.
Yes.
So that was the first thing I did, was like, finding the shows and finding the episodes. And it was started with 90. Then I, pitched it to the publisher, and they were looking for a little more sort of diversity of, shows being covered and the racial makeup of cast and what have you. And I said, great, happy to do that. But if I'm going to do that, I really like the episodes I had picked and shows, and the shows I covered. So I'm like, how about we make it 99? We still have the 9 connected to the 90s there. So then I threw in I added 9 more shows of a diverse nature, and plenty of, father there. Not as much father as would be ideal vis-a-vis what diversity was on television in the 90s. That comes up in the book, certainly. Yes. But so that's how it all arrived, was starting with what shows do I want to cover and what episodes do I want to cover. So there was a full-on list of episodes before I began the writing process. So that was the first step, was when I found the shows and the episodes, and then I went from there.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, I liked mentioning the crossover thing. So one thing I think about, especially that Fresh Prince of Bel-Air episode in particular, is one of my favorite television, I think, moments that just screams 90s, is when Carlton is dancing to the Oprah theme song when they're backstage. That is like one of my favorite moments. I think I've referenced that on a few times on the podcast. So yeah, it's definitely it's an impressive list of shows that you went through, and several shows that I don't remember or never have heard of. And I think one especially that stood out to me that just sounded so awful that I had to look it up was Cop Rock.
Yes. Cop Rock kind of ended up being the one fiasco that made the cut for the book. Just because it has, a very 90s, element to it. And also, I mean, there's other sort of procedural shows in the book, but I just knew Cop Rock as this sort of strange 90s fiasco of this short-lived one-season show that was like a musical version of the police procedural with all the seriousness you find in police procedurals.
Right.
This was not in the episode that I cover, but there's another episode where there is a man who sort of is selling babies on the black market, and he has his own song. He gets a big number, about him as like this guy dealing these babies, on the black market. So it was just this weird, bizarre.
Right. How do you make a song out of that?
Yeah. This weird 90s cultural footnote that like ended up being the like one sort of show of that ilk, because it wasn't the only 90s fiasco in the world of television, but it's just so sui generis as a like failure and curiosity that it was just like fun to throw that in the mix to be part of the tapestry of 90s police procedurals, but also as just like there were these strange fiascos in the 90s on TV, and back then like they couldn't necessarily be as buried as they might be able to be now in the deluge of content out there. It was a show on a network, and sure there was cable in the 90s, but like network TV was still so big, so have like this bizarre fiasco on like a network was like a significant thing, even if it's only remembered by people who have an affinity for those kind of fiasco shows and like failures, these interesting failures, because it is an interesting failure. It was a big swing. It wasn't a banal sort of boring show that just like faded out because nobody's interested in it. It is truly like, if you haven't seen the show, throw up some clips on YouTube or something sometime and get a sense of like how utterly bizarre of an experience it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point about it. Couldn't get as lost then. It was very easy to find, and I can't believe I missed that. But yeah, I looked it up on YouTube, and there was an episode where I think like the chief of police or something was sort of giving everybody a debrief of like a perpetrator or something they should be on the lookout for or something, and then he broke out into "Be careful out there"
Let's be
over and over
careful out
again.
there song, yes.
Oh my God, I would just have loved to have been a fly on the wall when that idea was brought up to go to be made into a TV show. It's like, here's my thought, everybody, is that we are just going to have some police officers and they're going to randomly bust out into song based on what their job responsibilities are that day. And somebody said that sounds great. Like, give it the green light. That's it's fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Were there any other sort of odd, how did that go to air moments that you had while you were putting together your book?
I'm sure I considered some, but Cop Rock definitely stood out. I'm trying to think of some other like sort of the, 90s fiasco sort of shows. I mean, like there was, I guess one that comes to mind would be the Dana Carvey show, which was when Dana Carvey was given a sketch show.
Yes,
and that aired famously, as he's told this anecdote time and time again. It's a well-practiced anecdote for Dana Carvey at this point. He put together this, writing staff of like, promising, burgeoning writers, and ABC decided to air it right after Home Improvement, the family sitcom, and he's always said that the very first sketch was Bill Clinton nursing a bunch of like puppies. So he had this fake prosthetic sort of like teats, and then all these puppies were sort of like weaning on him. And this was people's introduction to the Dana Carvey show after they had sat down to watch, Home Improvement, one of the foremost family sitcoms of the era. And that show lasted a handful of episodes. But it would have only been included to discuss sort of like the fiasco nature of like on the short live shows, the misguided shows, but Cop Rock already being included, and there being a few other shows in the vein of sketch shows, in the vein of like late night TV, which is a different thing. It's different than similar, the variety sort of like milieu of television. So that one, I definitely considered, but that sort of ground was covered in multiple ways, and there was other ground to cover. So I felt like one weird misfire show was, probably sufficient for the book. And in that way, Cop Rock, I think it made the most sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's definitely a fun chapter on that show for sure. That was a lot of fun to listen to. I could sort of picture just the ridiculousness in my mind as I was reading it. So you mentioned that you grew up watching a lot of TV, and I did too. I'm of that generation too, where it was kind of considered sort of a babysitter, and not in necessarily like a bad way, but it was like, there's something on that the kids can watch. I'll plop them down over here, and then, I can cook dinner or I can do the laundry or whatever. So I definitely grew up and have a lot of fond memories of watching TV. Could you, for the audience, could you help us like envision what was your living room or, family room, TV room, or wherever you're watching these shows? What did that room look like in the 90s?
Well, there'd be two of them. One from when I was very young, and then the other one that sort of like filtered out of the 90s, going into when watching stuff as a family is becoming less common. So in the first house I grew up in, there was you walk in, it was like the living room, like the front room of the house. There's the TV sort of like in a corner-ish, in like the classic old school, cathode ray TV in like the entertainment center.
Yes.
And then there's one couch sort of directly facing it.
Mm-hmm.
And then another couch, the longer couch. I'm thinking probably the smaller thing was like the left seat. There's like the couch proper along the wall going towards the door, like over the doorway to the rest of the house. So there's the two couches there.
Yeah.
And then there's like a little corner nook area. And definitely there was plenty of sitting on the floor watching TV there, though. So I have a couple of distinct memories related to that. One, you're talking about like the TV raising and the, I remember when I was in kindergarten, my mom, my dad would be at work. My mom would take a nap while I watched Muppet Babies. And that was always what I watched right before I would go to kindergarten was Muppet Babies. My mom would take a nap. So that very much TV's babysitter. I mean, she was there. If I needed her, I could have woken her up. But she was the, parental figure in the house. The authority figure in the house was asleep while I was watching Muppet Babies and having a grand old time. Except one time I fell asleep and I missed an episode of Muppet Babies, and I was displeased with that, perhaps for the rest of my life. I ended up seeing that episode eventually. Nickelodeon would just run things in reruns and reruns and reruns as their whole model. I mentioned in my Nickelodeon books why Nickelodeon shows don't have series finales proper, because they want to be able to just keep recycling them without any sense of that finality. And also related to that, I remember around like maybe first grade or so, I started having an actual proper sort of like bedtime, because like school was now like a serious thing. Before that, I remember being up to watching like Mary Tyler Moore show on Nick at Night, and that would be like on at like 10, or like the Bob Newhart show. But bedtime for me and my younger siblings became 9 p.m., which would be at that time, I'm trying to think of the 8 and 8:30 shows. Maybe that was when it was I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched. All I know is that I Love Lucy was at 9. And I remember bedtime going from 9 to the first commercial break of I Love Lucy to 9:15 to 9:30 after I Love Lucy. So that's at home. And then we moved to the house where my parents still currently live. And the TV room was during the time when there'd be any watching TV together, it was the den, which later, once, television was not going to be watched as like a group because all of us were like too old, that became my brother's bedroom also, when it became all the children get their own bedroom, which was probably when I was about 12 or so. It was the den. There was like, a couple of couches. It was like a small room. I mean, it was a den, and it was basically just for like watching TV. It was like the TV room. We had a television in the basement as well. And then my parents had a television in their bedroom. So the den, that's where we'd watch The Simpsons, watch Mystery Science Theater 3000 as a family, and whatever sitcoms we were watching as a family. Before, then, as I got to be tweenage, that I was not, sitting down to watch things with the family necessarily. So I'm trying to think of I don't know if I have any distinct memories of television watching in that room. The only thing I distinctly remember is when my aunt was watching us and my cousin Michael was there, and we were watching the movie Mercury Rising. And I got up to use the restroom during like a twist in the film, so I missed that. But Mercury Rising, in hindsight, is not a very good movie, so who cares? But I don't have as much of. I just remember it was like, watching The Simpsons, watching Mystery Science Theater 3000, watching whatever shows. But so that was just like a den, and now that's my dad. That room is now was my dad's at home office. Now he's retired, so now it's just sort of like a room in the house where stuff is. As happens once parents become empty nesters.
Yes,
just become either guest bedrooms. My old bedroom's now the guest bedroom, and my sister and brother's bedrooms are just rooms with stuff in them.
Yeah, sounds about right. Yes, I like your story about Muppet Babies, and what a great way to start the day. I personally, as I'm a huge fan of Muppet Babies. I was just listening to another podcast about it. It was fascinating. It was an excellent show. So it's amazing how much TV is sort of tied to your memories and timelines and stuff like that. That's pretty cool. It's very, very memorable.
Yeah, I was in PM kindergarten, so this was some late morning, early afternoon Muppet Babies. Before school, I mean, I remember a couple of the before school shows that were common that I would watch. While I would also every morning read the sports section of the Detroit Free Press and also go through the comics on the Detroit, the ones that published in the Detroit Free Press. The before school shows I remember for Scooby-Doo, well, Where Are You, Scooby-Doo, or Scooby-Doo, Where Are You, the old 60s Hanna-Barbera version was, and then Saved by the Bell started airing on, probably TBS.
Yes, I remember that too.
So I would watch that before school as well. When I was like young enough that I would have time for watching stuff before school. Once I got to like junior high or like high school or whatever, it was like sleeping in as late as possible while still be able to get everything done in the morning to get to school on time. Still take time to, at that point, I'd probably just be reading the sports section of the newspaper, not so much looking at the comics, not seeing what Garfield is up to or seeing what the Foxtrot kids were up to or what have you. But yeah, so those were definitely the shows I remember watching in the morning before school. Scooby-Doo, Saved by the Bell.
Nice. That is fantastic. And I'm old enough that I remember when Saved by the Bell was on and airing on Saturday mornings, and I remember when it was on in reruns too in the morning before school. And I think I definitely caught many more an episode of that show, which you also touch on in your book too, which was pretty funny. And I love the episode that you picked.
Big episode for that show.
Yes, and I'm sure that must have been a tough decision. There's just so many, and I was reminded of the whole Hot Sunday thing. That's the episode that you talk about. It's
Jesse's song.
Jesse's song. Okay, yeah. And so I was revisiting that Hot Sunday music video when the three girls in the show become professional singers in a very bizarre way, and just how much unnecessary slow motion there was incorporated into the Hot Sunday music video, including where Lisa does a cartwheel, which is, I mean, I think I can probably still do a cartwheel, but it's like, is it that impressive that she did a cartwheel that needs to be slowed down, or when they're like jumping over things? And
yeah, it's very Olivia Newton-John physical was like sort of the model for their really unusually well-produced music video for a bunch of high school kids. I mean, granted, they also started a spaghetti sauce business one time. They had a lot of, monetary access. Also, they're all kids from the Palisades. I mean, maybe like one of their parents could throw the money together to put together. But the music video that they make as Hot Sunday has better production value than the show Saved by the Bell itself, which makes it feel a little weird and uncanny that all of a sudden, like, the show's got more production value than when, say, Screech is dressed in drag as a Irish janitor to go secretly record the girls singing in the locker room, and it looks lower quality than the music video. It's like a weird sort of like it should be the inverse, but I mean the thought process that went to the production of Saved by the Bell seemed limited at best, but it was a successful show, so
Yes, ran for a very long time and continued on. Yeah, they seem to have a thing about getting dressed up into costume in that show, and it's reminding me of the Saved by the Bell. Is it the Hawaii movie? I think I forgot what it's called, but they all go visit Hawaii and rescue Kelly's grandfather's hotel. I want to say, and then there's a scene where again I think it's Screech and AC Slater have to dress up as exterminators to get people out of the hotel room or something, and then I don't know if they bug the room or something like that.
Possibly. It seems like maybe it would have been. And also because when you're talking about the costumes, what have you, and the Saved by the Bell movies, in Wedding in Las Vegas, I believe Screech and Zach and Slater all end up dressing as like showgirls to sort of like try and like hide from, I'm guessing, the mob, probably,
maybe.
Something along those lines. And so there was a lot of costumes and dressing up and hijinks and of all sorts in Saved by the Bell, because it's very broad comedy. It was a very broadly written show. It was 50-year-old men who were television veterans who probably remember like Sid Caesar's Show of Shows or whatever, and just be like, that's comedy. You dress up in a funny costume, and that's it. Funny costume equals joke, and nothing else has to be figured out if you've got somebody dressed up in a funny way.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's something that certainly is very telling of 90s TV and how granted, I don't really watch, I can't say I watch a ton of modern TV, but that's not a plot that I imagine happens very much in today's TV shows of dressing up as posing as somebody else, and then, or you make eye contact with somebody whose clothes you're somehow going to acquire and change into. I just feel like that's not going to happen in today's TV.
I wonder if it still happens in like kids TV,
Oh,
like,
maybe. That's
because I
true.
mean, like, I don't know, didn't see, say, like your 2000s eras and beyond, sort of like Nickelodeon shows or Disney shows or what have you. So I wonder if
Right.
like whatever those shows are now, I wonder if they still do that kind of comedy.
Probably.
I have no idea because I've never seen The Loud House or like what have you.
Right.
That's like the most recent show I think I could pull from cultural osmosis, because I remember like your Victorious, your iCarly's, which I also did not watch or what have you, but those are like 20 years ago or so now, or like Hannah Montana's like forever ago. So whatever going on now, I've got no idea. I mean, I don't know these days. Like, I mean, kids, I don't know how many of them are even watching Nickelodeon or how much that's even a thing at this point. So I can't even speak to how much, our kids watching broadcast television, or are they just watching YouTube stuff and things on streaming. So, I mean, I'm actually kind of curious, like what Nickelodeon is conceptually now as a network, because I have no idea. And I mean, it's a little bit of presumption, but I feel like, what I glean from the world around me is that, kids watch things on demand and they watch YouTube and what have you. So I don't know how popular sitting down to watch television as it airs is with children, but my intuition is it's definitely not as popular as it used to be, and it may not be popular at all. So I wonder how Nickelodeon functions these days. Maybe it's just creating television to be watched at another time, or to end up on Paramount Plus. I think would probably be where they would end up on, as Nickelodeon shows, because that's where all the old Nickelodeon shows are. And maybe that's what's happening. But maybe on those shows, people are still dressing up in wacky costumes to try and skulk about or what have you.
Right. Yeah. We don't have cable or anything like that, but when I have caught it, it seems like it's a lot of sort of tween shows, which is typically characterized by very bad acting.
That's very distinct. Yeah. There's that very distinct kind of kid acting.
Yes.
Which is, yeah.
Yeah. And then there's like Paw Patrol and shows like that, which are, I'm a parent of two. I have a 7 and a 9-year-old, so I can tolerate things like Paw Patrol, but the bad acting tween shows is where I can't. If we're on vacation or something, it's hard to watch.
I saw it because like, and also because like they often don't unlearn those habits. And I'm thinking, because I've heard people complain about that. And I've seen a little bit, I remember from, back in the day, but I saw the trailer for that 90s show. And because I was like, oh, well, I watched that 70s show, whatever. It's in the book.
Yes.
But those teens were doing that very distinct kind of tween acting that is so common now. And just like comparing that to the cast of that 70s show, who, were fairly talented, also a little bit older. But I was like, I'm not gonna be able to watch that 90s show or what, because like, I can't deal with this kind of acting. Or I did watch Fuller House out of curiosity for a few episodes, and that was like the same thing. It's just like there's that very broad, it's like everybody is like doing like bad theater acting, like that kind of style. And it's just sort of what they do. Everything is like a huge take. It's like everybody's like mugging like they're in vaudeville. It's almost like vaudevillian acting, but like on like a set. And just like it's very like it's very distinct. And once you're like aware of that as like a conceit, it's very hard to unsee when you're seeing it. You really internalize like they're doing that kind of acting. And it's it's not good.
Yes, it's horrible to watch. Yeah, and you talk about Full House and Fuller House in your book too. And I was not a huge Full House fan, but if it was on, TGIF, whatever, I would watch it. And I was quasi curious about Fuller House just because it had been so long since the show has been on. And my sister, who this podcast is inspired by, was a huge, huge John Stamos fan. So I was like, all right, I'll try to like suck it up and watch this show. But yeah, the acting and the plot lines and everything was so unbearable that I don't even think I got through as many episodes as you did before. I think I got through like 2 episodes, maybe 3, and I just couldn't take it anymore. So I refused to watch again because I just could not handle the acting. And I'm sure people will probably be throwing like rotten fruit at their phones or whatever as they're listening to this, but I just can't handle that kind of stuff at all.
No, I mean, like, I was happy for Jodie Sweetin and Andrea Barber to get some good acting. Especially Jodie Sweetin went through a lot in her life.
I like her too.
She's been very open about everything she's gone through, what have you. So I was, happy. It's like, hey, and like, she wasn't terrible. She wasn't necessarily good per se, but she wasn't like terrible on the show.
Right.
But those new kid actors were bad. And the storylines were just like so bad. The writing was so bad.
Yeah.
That there was the minor like amusements to be found quickly dissipated into this is just bad comedy writing, bad joke writing.
Right.
Kids aren't good actors.
No.
And the adults are passable in their acting at best. But so I made it, I think maybe 4, 5 episodes, maybe possibly 6 at most before I was like, I've seen enough here. The curiosity factor quickly dissipated for sure.
Right. Yeah, it was interesting for about 10 minutes to like sort of relive Friday nights in 1990, but now I can't do it anymore. Well, and so on the vein of shows that kind of drove me nuts and I think drove you sort of nuts too. So in your book, you touched on shows like Beavis and Butthead and Ren and Stimpy, which you sort of described as, I think, like a gross out humor.
Gross out humor, yeah.
Yeah, and why do you think that was like a thing in the 90s? What's up with that?
Well, yeah, the sort of gross out humor, it's always sort of, well, I don't know if it's always been around. In a way, yes, in a way, no. But it was kind of big, certainly on 90s TV. And in my Nickelodeon book, where I write about every show that had episodes that aired in the 90s, they all get covered. So be it a show like You Can't Do That on Television, which barely eked into the 90s with new episodes, or a show like SpongeBob, which started in 1999, they all get covered. But I go into that quite a bit in the Ren Stimpy chapter. I think like for shows in that vein, for that audience, it qualifies as sort of transgressive because it's sort of like gross, it's inappropriate. It's the things you're told like aren't appropriate, as like your parents are and like the world's trying to teach you the basic manners that a small child doesn't necessarily know inherently. And so like the idea of like all this gross stuff, it's a form of like transgressive comedy, of boundary pushing comedy that is acceptable to put in front of a child, more or less. And like it just like the very act of doing it registers as being like funny or salacious to a kid. Like a lot of
true
at the time with like Beavis and Butthead, a lot of the fandom for it, there was some teenagers or what have you, sure, but I like it would be like kids who were younger than that who saw it as like a show that was like sort of like that wasn't like okay to watch, that their parents disapproved of. And yeah, it's just sort of like the banality of it. Now, of course, as an adult, I realized like Mike Judge was kind of like making fun of that stuff in a way, but also sometimes having his cake and eating it too, of being like, I'm sort of making fun of these sort of like knuckleheaded, like gross guys, but also isn't it also kind of funny, sort of like, being able to like, serve both things. But like Beavis and Butt at least did have like a cultural sort of substance to it, in a way, like Ren and Stimpy, a show that was one of the original 3 Nickelodeon Nicktoons that I do not like that show.
No,
and just the comedy was just so gross out focused, and there's no there. It's truly just about the transgressive nature in it, as perceived by the audience. Whereas, like, I don't mind comedy that pushes boundaries or is transgressive, but it just has to be
Same
clever
here.
and
Yeah.
good. And like, I love a show like Veep, which it's not from the 90s or whatever, but it's like where it's like very vulgar, but it's clever and well written and pointed satire,
Hmm.
and it's all good. But yeah, that sort of like 90s style. And there's also stuff like the Spike and Mike Sick and Twisted like festivals or whatever. There was all sorts of things. And it was just at the time, and then it became like a cultural cachet thing. Also, maybe also because at the time that stuff wasn't as prominent or readily available. We live in an era now of like where the rise and like dissipation of like 4chan or like all the
Yeah.
things one can find on Reddit. Like if you want to see things that are like disgusting and like in a purient, even like morally questionable way, it's all readily available. You do it any moment. Uh,
Sure.
there is no more shock or surprise than like
Hmm.
the world is so much the world's so open in ways good and negative that something like Ren and Stimpy, would not even be like a conceptual blip vis-a-vis what somebody could find on some random subreddit. Some 12-year-old
Very
goes
good
to
point.
Reddit and can see horrifying things and like haunting images. Back then, you're 9 years old and Stimpy pulls like a giant booger out, and that's the height of like transgressive shock humor. And
Yeah.
the world's changed, and that's probably plays part into it as well. But yeah, that sort of vein of humor has never really been my thing. Even as a child, I was never really
No.
to like gross out humor. I was never even
No.
then. It's not something I grew out of. There's some stuff I grew out of, comedy wise, sure, but I was never into the gross out comedy. And like even like now, and now still, but yeah, just never
Yeah.
was my thing.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, me neither. And didn't one of them eat kitty litter or something?
Probably
I
both
don't,
of them. I
I think
mean,
they did. I
there's
don't know
definitely a
why I
lot of
remember that, but
cat litter. I mean, in the show, and a lot. I mean, there's about a cat and a dog, and there's a lot of strange
so
stuff going
gross.
on there. And
Yeah.
it was definitely the most stringent of their gross out shows.
Yes.
Occasionally, maybe Rocko's Modern Life would get into that realm, but it was more clever, and they did less of it certainly than Ren and Stimpy, which is sort of like the paragon of gross out humor for kids,
Yeah.
of the 90s and of that era for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really great observation because you're absolutely right. Yeah. People wanted to find something shocking or gross or whatever to watch so they could do it in 2 seconds. But back then, that required certainly a little bit more work and or just sitting and waiting for it to happen.
Yeah.
So that was certainly a way to do it by watching that. But yeah, I never understood that. They're just kind of, I think the whole like cartoons that kind of look sort of creepy and are kind of
Yeah.
ugly and not like cute, or when they sort of reboot a lot of cartoons, I feel like from the 80s now, the way that they illustrate them, I find very unpleasant. And I'm a huge Disney fanatic, long running Disney historian fan. And what they have done to the way that Mickey Mouse looks and Goofy, I think is truly unacceptable and is a disgrace. And I don't understand the appeal of kind of eerie looking, ominous, creepy, clear. I think it looks like Mickey has some sort of, or maybe it's Goofy has some sort of like liver issue. His eyes are not the correct color. It is highly disturbing. It makes me very uncomfortable. So I'm with you that I think that shows like Ren and Stimpy, and if that doesn't get a reboot, I'm a-okay with that because
Yeah.
was not good, not good at all.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I was thinking about too, as I was reading through your books, is I think one thing that the 90s, especially, and 80s too, were really known for were their TV theme songs. Because now anybody who watches TV now, the intros are 10 seconds, if that. They used to be anywhere from probably 30 seconds to some, I think, were even over like a minute long. Was there any, can you think of any TV shows that you think from the 90s that had like the creme de la creme of TV theme songs?
I mean, there's only one answer, and that's "Hey Sandy" from The Adventures of Pete and Pete, the Polaris song "Hey Sandy." I didn't
Good
cover
one.
Pete and Pete in 99 episodes, in part
Yes.
because I wrote so much about it in the Nickelodeon 90s.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that is like one of the foremost TV theme songs. That show is great music in general from
Yes.
really talented artists. They really cared about the music. You can find it, people are so inclined to. Several years ago now, I wrote an article for the website Up Rocks when I was a music writer for Up Rocks about the music of Pete and Pete. And
Okay.
so, yeah, people just, search Adventures Pete and Pete, Chris Morgan, Up Rocks, something along those lines. You can find that for sure.
Yeah. I'll find
But
it and put it in the show notes.
oh yeah, let people find. I collaborated with somebody who did a lot of interviews for that piece. That she handled the interviews and transcriptions, and then I sort of wrote and I picked and chose from those interviews and what have you. So we talked to a lot of the people related to the show and to the music, the creators of the show, and everything like that.
Awesome.
But yeah, that's definitely up there in terms of the best TV theme songs. I mean, The Simpsons is a classic one that sort of has just become sort of cultural wallpaper. So you don't necessarily even think about it, especially these days. You talk about they're not really being theme songs anymore. I still watch The Simpsons at this point. I can't stop watching. I've seen every single episode. It's my favorite show of all time. Also, if anybody dropped out of The Simpsons, after its classic run, it's kind of soft rebooted itself in the last few years, and it's a genuinely good show. Like, it's not as good as it was in like its peak, but as somebody who's watched the entire run of the show, it's a genuinely good show that feels kind of different while still being The Simpsons. And so I would say that if you dropped out and if people are curious, so inclined, it's worth jumping back into it. But it has good theme songs beyond "Hey Sandy." I mean, the Daria theme song is a classic one. And also it's nice because it's like one thing that's still there in the show. Because the thing about Daria is, of course, that once it was airing on like MTV anymore, they had to strip the music rights out. And so they put in a bunch of different music that was once, notable songs, but they're all gone now. It's just sort of like random interstitial music on like the DVDs or what have you. But yeah, I say definitely, like, I mean, just off the top of my head, "Hey Sandy" from Pete and Pete wins the day as like one of the best TV theme songs ever, and certainly why I can think of as being the best from the 90s. With all due respect to, say, the Friends theme song or, the Frasier is more of an outro than an intro. And that's, I love Frasier, but that's just sort of like a goofy affinity for that sort of thing. But, "Hey Sandy" by Polaris, the in-house band for Pete and Pete. They have an entire album of songs from the show. And that's my choice.
Nice. That is, I like that a lot. I love Pete and Pete. That is probably one of my very favorite shows from the 90s as well. Just really epitomizes creative, insightful children's television that I feel like is kind of a lost art at this point. And I think most of this, I think there's only a few seasons of that show, right? Like, was it two or three or something?
There's 3 seasons of the show. The first 2 came out on DVD. They never put the third one on DVD, which is a shame because 2 of my favorite episodes are from the 3rd season. The one where Big Pete becomes the bus driver, and the one where Big Pete joins the wrestling team and he ends up wrestling Endless Mike Hellstrom. Those are 2 of my favorites. The 3rd season in general, not quite as good, a little more focused on Little Pete, which makes sense. It's for the Nickelodeon audience. And by that point, Big Pete was, like 17, something like that. So they started focusing on Little Pete. They gave him a couple new friends in Monica the Krebs Scout and Wayne, who was not a good addition to the show. Nothing against that child actor, just the character was a little annoying. And so the first 2 seasons they are available on DVD, and I have those, of course, naturally.
Same.
Really enjoyable watches. They did 3, and technically the first, I think, 4 or 5 episodes are considered like specials, and then they were just sort of folded into the first season. Culturally speaking, after that. But like if you go look at, say, like the Wikipedia page for list of Pete and Pete episodes, something of course I've done, they've got the specials sort of listed as like their own thing, like St. Valentine's Day Massacre, Space Universe Johnny Unitas, I think maybe the New Year's Pete episode. I don't remember, but it feels they're technically specials that predate the show being picked up as a show.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Just the best. I love Pete and Pete. My goodness. Is there a TV show theme song that you think is just the worst? Is kind of an earworm for you from the 90s?
Let me think about what's not a good theme song or one that's annoying. I mean, nothing comes. I mean, like the Saved by the Bell theme song's silly,
Yeah.
but it's not like annoying. It's certainly kind of earwormy, and it's like inane. I'm trying to think of anything from like the world of like Nickelodeon or whatever that was like not a good theme song, or like from because a lot of them like are more kind of like because they are kind of like long, but they'll be kind of like instrumentally or what have like they have an instrumentation to them, which makes it a little trickier to be annoying. But not. I mean, I'm sure there are ones, but clearly not so much that they've like burned their way into my brain as like a theme song I don't enjoy. But I was because like you're talking about like how theme songs used to be so long or what have you. I was watching Newhart, the '80s sitcom that eked into the '90s and thus ended up making my book because it's kind of a famous series finale.
Yeah.
But like their theme song, like their opening credits are like probably close to a minute, and it's just like this very pastoral instrumental. And it's like, so if I'm watching it like it's available on Amazon Prime now, it's a pretty easy skip because it's like there's no substance to it, and like the opening credits aren't even that like interesting.
Yeah.
That still goes on for like a minute.
Yeah.
And like the idea of like that now is like so anathema to like how TV works.
Yeah.
And it's funny to be like, oh yeah, they just spent a minute with this like, I mean, granted, I think it was Henry Mancini who made the theme song, but it's not remarkable. And it's just like shots of like the countryside. You don't even see any of the characters.
Yeah.
And you see you see their names, of course, but like it's just so drawn out. And like, yeah, that's like completely gone. It's like, I mean, at least something like the Full House theme song, which is kind of iconic. There's all these shots, and there's this song, and there's all these shots of like the characters, and they're all around. And so it's just like a justification to it, but like there's like no justification to some of the lengths of those theme songs of shows back in the day. They were just stretching to like reach the time frame of what they had available to them at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly necessary. Definitely unnecessary. And I always loved when the shows like Full House and Family Matters where it's like the camera person sort of like pulled up on the act or whatever, and they were just happened to be like waxing their car, and then they look up and then smile. It's like, this is so stupid,
Yeah, that's a fun conceit for sure. But I also just think about like filling television time for then versus now. I've been watching occasionally Seinfeld on Netflix, just like if I need something to have on or whatever. And I've forgotten that a lot of the episodes had like two like of Jerry Seinfeld's sort of like stand-up segments, because in reruns and syndication, the episodes are chopped down such that, for years I was just watching him and only seeing like one of those. But you watch him like, oh yeah, there's another one of these that clearly was very easy for them to cut out when they had to, make time for syndication. So when you watch some of that old stuff in its non-syndicated form, which is how things get watched now. I mean, really don't watch anything in syndication these days. Occasionally I'll throw on a Seinfeld or something if I'm watching something else, and I'm just like flipping channels. But yeah, definitely, the television as a medium, in some ways it's compressed, but then again, in streaming, you'll find a show like Stranger Things where it's like, this episode's 130 minutes long, and it's like, why you didn't need to do that? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So like, or like when Arrested Development made the move to Netflix and every episode was like 7 minutes too long. It's like sometimes the constriction of television is actually a benefit to creators, even if like you can't do as much as you want, as much as you could back in the day. It's the old push and pull of,
Yes. I so agree with that. I always find myself thinking that about movies, especially holiday movies, are usually for me about 20 to 30 minutes too long.
yeah.
It's like Christmas Vacation, classic Christmas movie that we watch every year. But it's like once they go get the Chevy Chase's boss, then I'm done. I don't need to see anything past that. Or like with Elf, it's like that movie's about half an hour longer than it needs to be. But that's a really good point about how TV just really kind of got to pack it all in and get the most bang for your buck.
Yeah.
I so agree with that. Maybe that's why TV from when we were kids and teenagers is so memorable, because it's like comes in little chunks, not some long drawn out thing that you start to kind of space out about as you really focus for that 25 minutes or whatever it is that the show ran for.
Yeah. And just speaking about like movies, like I think like the most famous example of movie like being a little too long is like I always feel like everybody has seen like 2/3 of Stripes. Nobody has seen all of Stripes.
Yeah.
So that's like the most watched, like the movie that like most people have seen but not finished. It just like beat on like probably because you're catching on TV or whatever. But like I feel like I've never like finished that movie, but I've seen like 2/3 of it multiple times. I feel like that's just sort of like one of those films where that is like a common cultural experience of watching most but not all of Stripes.
Yep, that's true. I would agree. Well, so my I guess kind of last question sort of about your book, and then I have a couple of nostalgia rapid fire questions that I like to ask people at the end of the show if you have the time.
Sure.
My question would be, if you were to you met somebody on the street or whatever, and they had never seen a single show from the 1990s for one reason or another, and you had to give them a short list of shows, maybe 3 to 5 shows, and maybe not the kind of go-tos that everybody would assume, what few shows would you recommend that person would have to see to really get a sense of what TV in the 1990s was like?
That's a very good question, particularly pertinent in terms of like what my book is sort of doing as well, because it's about trying to capture the 90s. It's not just like my favorite TV shows, my favorite episodes. It's like I am, for example, not the biggest fan of Friends.
Yeah.
I just think it's a totally fine sitcom, but I think it's kind of middle of the road. There's several sitcoms I like more than that, but obviously it has to be included in the book and has to be talked about because its cultural impact is as big as like any 90s show. And that's undeniable. Like, it spawned movie stars. It was massive. And I may prefer Seinfeld. I may prefer Frasier. I may prefer some shows that weren't even like on that sort of like level, but it had to sort of be included as a show. So if I was going to try and synthesize the 90s into a few shows for somebody, The Simpsons would have to be included because The Simpsons was so permeated culture and also was so capturing the culture of the time, even the best it could as an animated show. And I mean, obviously, there's a lot of episodes of that, and maybe I just be like, like here's a few episodes or something like that, because there's so much to it. But to understand like 90s culture, watching The Simpsons in like episodes from like 1995, 1996 or whatever would be so pertinent. Absolutely. Seinfeld would be included just because it so shaped the culture of the 90s for sure, and also is a very 90s show in certain ways in terms of the way it looks and sort of all the logistics of life in the 90s, which is commonplace in all of these shows, obviously. But it has a really way, it captures the 90s in a way I feel like Friends or Frasier or shows of like that ilk doesn't really find. Shows of course, like I love Frasier, but like there's nothing that really says 90s about Frasier to me as much as I love the show, other than like, the technology or like the giant suits that like Niles and Frasier wear or what have you. But Seinfeld definitely fits into that as well. I feel like, I kind of want to say Murphy Brown definitely has something of like what is it? There's something 90s in the feel of that for sure.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is because they would make a lot of references and do a lot of stuff like that. And also became part of the cultural sort of like conversation, particularly when Murphy Brown, had her child Avery.
Yeah.
And of course, but it has a really nice feel too. It's not like the best show, but like if I'm trying to capture
Yeah.
the 90s, and then well, you gave me 3 to 5 shows, so I'm gonna try and grab one for kids, and then I'm gonna try and grab a drama.
Okay.
So if I was gonna do one for like from like Nickelodeon or what have you, it would be Clarissa Explains It All, which is in the book, as opposed to I love Pete and Pete, but Pete and Pete takes place in like it almost feels devoid of time and space in its way.
It's true.
I mean, I think it's the best of the shows, the Nickelodeon shows for sure.
Yeah.
But it's also it feels like it's about but whereas Clarissa has a very 90s sort of feel to it, but also like it was popular and Clarissa was popular.
Yeah.
And so like if you're trying to get a sense of like what kids and tweens were watching or exploring in the 90s, it would be a very good choice.
Yes,
and then
definitely.
From the world of dramas from
Cop
the
Rock.
90s.
Cop Rock, maybe, or
Yeah. Just grab a Cop Rock episode, be like, and just like lie to them and say, this was the biggest show. Everybody loved Cop Rock. I mean, I feel like probably part of me wants to be like, just find like something that was like popular, and maybe so then it could be something like, I guess Law and Order's like legacy goes so far beyond the 90s, and the same thing with the ER. So
yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking about ER. Yeah,
it's much more like a slice of a show that just sort of like goes on. Where I feel like maybe something like NYPD Blue has more 90s to it, although it went on as well, so much so that Mark Paul Gosselaar was able to join the cast of this show. But I feel like the ER's like tale and legacy goes like too far beyond the idea of like the conception of 90s TV, and I mean certainly Law and Order that's the case. So I might land on something like NYPD Blue to be like, this is the sort of drama that was popular at the time. Dennis Franz was a TV star.
Yes.
And so I feel like that would be sort of the procedural dramatic TV show from the 90s. Of course, I didn't end up touching on anything from like HBO, but then again, HBO wasn't really starting to do things to the late 90s anyways. And then you're talking about like The Sopranos or something like that. And that's not really, I mean, Sopranos made the book because, but it's still like, that was like towards the end of the book and about starting to set the table for the next decade. So throw some Simpsons, Seinfeld, Clarissa Explains It All, Murphy Brown, NYPD Blue. I think if you're checking out those shows from the 90s, it gives you a good picture of what 90s TV was and what 90s culture was.
Yeah. Nice. I think that is a good list, a good well-rounded perspective of the greatest 10 years on television. Let's
I wouldn't disagree.
I
think the 90s was like the best decade for TV, for sure. I mean, the 70s were solid, but the 90s was like, obviously you had like the rise of cable, but you didn't have like the oversaturation.
Yes.
So it really also just because like you had The Simpsons, you had like Seinfeld, you had Frasier. So it just ended up through a mix of technological circumstances and just cultural happenstance. It is, to me, pretty clearly the best decade for television. As somebody who's watched television from like the 50s to now, watched all sorts of shows, I've seen episodes of Our Miss Brooks, and I've, seen whatever, going on TV right now. The Brother's Son on Netflix, I just watched that. So I've run the gamut, and I'd say the 90s is the best, you know?
Yeah. Well, and probably one of the last times ever, maybe there's some exceptions that maybe in the early 2000s, but where, tens of millions of people are all tuning into the same show. I mean, I guess people watch the Super Bowl, but not still not to the same numbers that they used to be. And, more people watch the halftime show, yada, yada. Pun intended for many in a couple ways with that comment. So yeah, I think it's, one of the last decades that it was a collective thing for people to do together. Did you catch the, series finale of Cheers? Did you catch the series finale of Murphy Brown. That just doesn't really happen anymore. I don't think there's the same sort of water cooler talk about TV as there used to be, which is kind of unfortunate. And, I feel grateful that I grew up when I did. And I'm sure everybody feels that way and feels nostalgia for when they were a child and a teenager and stuff. But I feel like I'm very grateful for the time that I grew up in. And I think you do too, that we got to experience those things. And it was kind of a collective experience, whether it was with our friends or with our family, as we were all sort of a part of watching TV shows.
Yeah. It was, it's nice. It's a good decade. Yeah. Now, things are watching, but on streaming, you can't have that cultural moment because people are streaming things, or even if they're watching it, like, I feel like some of the HBO shows have had a little bit of that cultural sort of cachet to them, but not in the same way. I feel like, and they're not being watched by the same number of people. I mean, that's certainly led into the 2000s a bit, because like I'm sure if you look at the numbers on like the Friends finale, for example, I'm sure that was massive, and that was but that's sort of like the cultural legacy in the 90s carrying over into the 2000s. Like I'm trying to think of like the series finale of like Mad Men or Breaking Bad or like Sopranos, maybe Sopranos, something like that might have had like that kind of, but even then that's still a little more niche, is not quite to the same level. I don't, the TV landscape certainly, and the sort of like these cultural touchstones, these zeitgeist capturing things. To the extent that capturing the zeitgeist still means something, it's in a very different way, and it seems to happen more. It still can feel like it can happen in movies, but like TV, the way our relationship with TV as a medium has just changed so much that even sometimes we're discussing TV, we're talking about things that are streaming and being watched on computers and phones and tablets, not even actually on a TV necessarily. TV is now like a medium, a concept of episodic storytelling as much as it is literally a description of what we're looking at when we're watching something. It's the conception of what TV is completely morphed, and is like becoming increasingly, it's not like a retronym, but I can't think of the exact right sort of like nomenclature to apply to it, but we've just gleaned the name from what's becoming increasingly like an archaic idea, and just calling it television because it's a style of entertainment. It's like if we called music records. Basically, it's just like we call it, I guess film is, when you refer to film, that's kind of the same thing. Everything being shot digitally now. You're not watching, even you go to the movie theater, you're not watching like actual like film going through like a, it's not like when I they watch like an old Columbo episode and he's talking to like a projectionist, and the projectionist is changing reels, but we still refer to film. It's just like the imprinting of words, and like words mean what we say they mean in a way. And I mean, so much of language is like built on just in internalizing what something means regardless of what it actually originally meant or stood for. And I mean, like, so much of what we say is based off Latin that we don't even comprehend. So that's just the way language works. And now it's applied to television. That time marches on, and now television is, fittingly also comes from I'm going to say the Greek with the tele and the vision or what have you, but it's we don't think of it as meaning what it literally mean in Greek, and we don't think about it as what it literally meant 30 years ago. It's just we've watched it evolve.
It's an umbrella term.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good observation, because when we say TV, it's probably at least half of those people are not actually watching whatever it is that we're discussing. They're not watching it on a TV. They're probably watching it on a phone or iPad. That is so true. So like one thing I like to do with guests who are on the show for the first time is do what I like to call nostalgia rapid fire, which is something I kind of somewhat lifted from Oprah, which is kind of a long story. But anyway, so I like to kind of get a sense of people's childhood and what they were kind of into when they were kids growing up in the 80s or 90s. So I just have a couple of nostalgia questions for you. before we wrap here. Let's see, what record, tape, or CD did you listen to so much that you basically wore it out or scratched it, or it got too, you had a tape if it got the tape reel got all goofed up? Is there anything that
Let's see. CD from my childhood. I remember the first CD I bought. I don't know. I'll say this as I try and
Yeah.
think of the one I probably listened to the most. It was 16 Stone by Bush.
Ooh,
Was the first
nice.
CD
Good
I
one.
ever owned. But I probably got more into music certainly in like, when I got a little bit older into the 2000s or so, and like, but so probably the CD I was listening to the most at the time and wearing out. I mean, also part of it is that when I, came into the world of getting really into music was also sort of aligned with the rise of Napster. And so
Yes.
it became,
Mhm.
I had a lot of burnt CDs that were just
Yes.
collections of music. And I listened to a lot of like punk and like of like the pop punk sort when I was starting to really get into music. But as a kid, I did have. I feel like you can sort of like tell how old somebody is by what Weird Al CD they owned or what Weird Al album they owned. And the one I
Nice.
owned was Bad Hair Day. And so,
Ah.
if you want to get a sense of my specific age and frame of reference or what have you, is that's the
Mhm.
one I owned. My brother's a little younger than me. He owned Running with Scissors, and so
Yes.
there you have it on that front. There, I certainly
Yes.
got plenty of listens out of that
Mhm.
particular album of
Yes.
Weird Al's for
I had
sure.
Eat It.
Yeah,
Eat It was my first Weird Al album, I think.
yeah. So
So
also, yeah, I played as a child in the '90s. Sort of listened to that plenty. Listened to a little bit of Bush's 16 Stone.
nice.
And I know I had a couple other CDs for sure, but that was also when you'd buy a CD for like a song. So I had the Chumbawamba CD for
Oh,
Cup
jeez.
Thumping. I had the Semisonic CD for Closing Time.
Yes.
So there was
Yes.
that, what have you. I only ever owned the one cassette, and it was The Impression That I Get by the Mighty Mighty Bosstones. So,
Ka-single?
well,
Was
no,
it a ka-single or just
uh,
a full album?
I just realized that wasn't the name of the album. I think the album was called Let's Face It, maybe. And that single was Impression That I Get. But also, I listened to a lot of Beastie Boys' Hello Nasty album as well.
Hmm.
So
All good
there's
picks. All
some
good picks.
albums that era for sure.
Okay. I was glad that nothing mentioned on your list was country because
Oh, I never was into
okay.
country.
Phew. All right, we're same. We're in good company here. Okay, good answers there.
Not rapid though. For the rapid fire, I was notably not
yes.
rapid on.
Yeah, that's all right. That's okay. Let's see. What movie from the 90s could you watch on repeat? Or it could be 80s. What movie from the 80s or 90s?
Well, my two of my favorite movies. I can't call them. They're two of my top five movies, and they're ones I rewatch. One's from the '80s, one's from the '90s. Now I saw these both in adulthood. They would, as a child, neither of them. They would have both been over my head, and to agree not to. So two of my all-time favorite movies. My favorite movie of all time is Repo Man, Alex Cox film starring Emilio Estevez, Harry Dean Stanton. A weird sort of like punk, you know, nihilistic dark comedy with a lot of like punk element to it and like a good satire to it. And that's my favorite movie of all time. I love movies, but like if I watch a movie more than say like twice, it's one I really love. And I've seen Repo Man, like 7, 8 times, something, more than that probably at this point. And then a movie that only recently that I, watched for the first time is like in the last couple of years, but I now own it on Blu-ray. I've seen it 5 or 6 times. I have one of my tattoos is related to the film. And so Richard Linklater's Slacker, which is a movie that like I watched it and I was like, this is good. This is interesting. And then like I was quickly like, I'm going to watch this again. And then I watched it again. Then I bought the, Blu-ray and I watched it again. And that movie I love it. It's great, but it's also just really like an interesting, inspirational in a way, not in terms of like its content. It's not like some chicken soup for the soul type thing, but like his DIY ethos behind it and everything like that. I really admire it. Absolutely. And then also, from the first time I saw it, like as a teenager to now, it's like a classic 90s favorite and Emily quotable is The Big Lebowski, which is, some people's fandom probably skews a little too, far with like their sort of like, Lebowski Fest and what have you. That's a little too much enthusiasm for like a cultural artifact for me personally, but that is a great movie. The Coen brothers are great filmmakers, but in terms of, so there's like movies from the 90s that I've seen a bunch. There's also some classic 80s movies, Die Hard, Ghostbusters, Gremlins, also Gremlins 2, a really good sequel. So that's all, these are all quality movies. But yeah, if people are out there have like a certain sort of, indie punk sort of sensibility and like sort of like interesting sort of like quasi comedies with like an interesting cultural feel to them. If you haven't seen Repo Man or Slacker, I'd highly recommend both of them. They're two really interesting, high quality films that are fairly distinct. I was almost said fairly unique, but unique is not a word that has gradations to it, despite how people often use it. But yeah, they're distinct and interesting films, and I highly recommend both of them.
Nice. That's another good list. I don't think I'm familiar with both of them. I can picture what the cover art for both of those or movie poster, whatever looks like for both of those, but I can't say I've seen either one of those. So I'll have to add it to my to-do list after my kids go to sleep and I'm alert for 20 minutes. I'll break it up. Yeah. All right. We'll do two more here. What was your favorite cereal to eat as a kid?
Oh, I mean, and as somebody who would have breakfast, a bowl of cereal basically every morning before school, I definitely remember a couple, and now it's just like the idea of like being raised by TV, all well and good, but my diet as a kid is something reflecting upon. It's like, it's wild what I was, allowed to eat. The amount of like fast food that like I would eat as a kid, and the amount of like soda I would drink. I say soda even though I'm from pop country. I just prefer the word soda. Like the amount of like Code Red Mountain Dew or like Surge I would drink. But so like my two cereals I remember enjoying the most, and I just can't imagine. I mean, like, I feel like I can taste the amount of sugar in them, even like now, were Oreo O's and the Reese's Peanut Butter Puff cereal, which I thought they were both absolutely delicious. But they're just like, I have that distinct memory of artificial flavor and like now to like an adult palate, like revolting sweetness, especially Oreo O's. Oreo O's is like, because there wasn't just like the sugar coated like chocolate pieces. They would have like their little, dehydrated marshmallow pieces in the mix too.
Yes.
And it must have been like the most sugary cereal in the world and like the most artificial tasting cereal in the world. But as a kid, I loved it. And I was eating that aplenty. And the same with the Reese's Peanut Butter Puffs, like that artificial peanut butter flavor, just so distinct in my memory. And I ate plenty of other stuff, but those are the two I remember enjoying the most.
Yes.
Regrettably with hindsight, but
Yes. Oh yeah. And Reese's peanut butter cup, anything is oh my God. Same with my dad is we'd eat that like all day, every day if we could, but that's not a good idea. So I get the appeal. I'm with you on that. I am with you on that. Well, I guess I'll have to ask you this one because I have to make sure I ask all my author friends this question is, when it comes to notebooks and loose leaf paper, are you team wide ruled or team college ruled?
I have handwriting wise a little loosey goosey and a little large, so wide ruled works better because otherwise I'm really trying to constrain things. And if I'm not like writing something out properly, I'm probably even going beyond the looser strictures of wide ruled in my writing and in my handwriting. And so I have like, I had some like, if I have notebooks that are like, college ruled or what have you, or like small notebooks, which aren't even like going by the permutations of either those kind of size regulations, I'm using multiple lines or what have you. Because my handwriting is such. And also, I don't know, it's also I'm left-handed, so like the handwriting of it all is a slightly different experience, such as it is with everything being put forward towards the right-handed sort of vast majority of people. It's like as a kid, I'm using a pencil to like write something in school or whatever. I have experienced that if you're right-handed, you probably never had, of your hand dragging over what you just wrote and having like graphite like on your hand that you have to wash off after you write. That
Yeah.
a common thing that happens to a lefty, and
Yes.
so that also maybe has something to do with my handwriting not existing within the parameters set forth by the rules, be they wide or college. But I prefer wide because I can stick to
Yes.
that a little bit better. It looks a little bit less sloppy.
Yeah.
Only a little bit less sloppy, but a little bit less sloppy if I do that.
Well, now that you say all that, that makes complete sense of why you would use wide ruled. So I will accept that answer. Although I am team college ruled myself, I will not discriminate. So that makes complete sense. I'm right-handed, so
Yeah.
I have my whole one side of my family, my wife's side of the family. I swear everybody's left-handed. So I have try to have some empathy because I know that everything's designed for right-handed people, and that is, I think, more of a pain in the butt than I think us right-handers realize.
Yeah, especially, I mean, like when I was a kid, it was when they still try and make you be right-handed. So I definitely in kindergarten, they were trying to be like, hey, why don't you just, use these right-handed scissors instead and just like do things right-handed. It's like, well, no, it's not going to work for me because,
Right.
I'm left-handed. My brother's left-handed. My dad's left-handed. So it, such as it is. And I'm like left-sided, as they say as well, because if I'm like kicking anything, I definitely like, go with my like left foot as well. But yeah, I'm very much left-handed in everything I do. I can use, my right hand to some degree, but like the idea of like say writing with my right hand, I could do it, but I can even like feel it in my brain as I'm like doing it. Like my brain is like, well, this is the opposite like of what you should be doing logistically. So maybe just change it and flip it around. But yeah, definitely as a kid, I was still young enough that like in like, preschool, or like, I'm old enough rather, that in preschool, kindergarten, what have you, there was nudging, some of it gentle, some of it not so gentle, to just be right-handed. But it didn't take. And so I live in a world, where the vast majority of people are right-handed. So it's fair, all things considered, for things to be right-handed focused, but it can be a little inconvenient for sure.
Yes. Well, one thing I always realized that while I was doing a couple episodes ago, I did a show about the history of the camcorder, which is a big deal in the 80s and 90s. And I didn't even realize this, didn't even think of it, but camcorders have always been designed for right-handed people. So, all those parents trying to capture their kids' 3-hour-long soccer game, if you're a left-hander, I mean, that must have been a very uncomfortable 3 hours, not only with a very heavy video camera on your shoulder, but also having to use your non-dominant hand. That must have been a real struggle. So, Chris, thank you so much for being on the show. Can you just, before we wrap up here, can you please tell our listeners again about your books and where they can find you?
Absolutely. And again, I appreciate you having me on the podcast. It was a very fun conversation. So yes, the priority wise, 99 episodes that define the 90s TV milestones from Arsenio to Homer to yada, yada, yada is my upcoming book. It's available for pre-order now, wherever pretty much you find books, be that Amazon, Barnes and Noble, the publisher's McFarland, if you want to buy it directly from the publisher. Okay. If you're interested in this sort of milieu, which you listen to this podcast, I imagine you are, the Nickelodeon 90s. My previous book is also still available. And you can get these also in ebook form. McFarland puts them out, but that's also a McFarland book. So you can find that, by searching for it on Amazon. I have an author page on Amazon now for like my books. I had to have them remove a few books by Chris Morkins who aren't me, that they just sort of glommed on there. I didn't, write these. There's like some like children's books and stuff on there. It's like, I don't necessarily need this in the mix for my books, but so I do that. I don't, do as much promoting of articles that I write or have written as I used to back in the day. I do culture writing of like about TV and movies for Yard Barker primarily these days in their entertainment section. So my work can be found there. If you want to find me on social media, I'm on Twitter, or X, or when I prefer to call it Twitter. Who cares what Elon Musk wants? It's at Chris X Morgan I don't use it a lot per se in terms of tweeting things, but I do occasionally. And also, if you just want to reach out to me or say something to me there, you could there. Or I'm on Instagram, which is I set it up for my hosting of trivia for the company Sporkle. So if you can put up with the fact that the majority of my posts are about whatever trivia show I'm hosting that evening, it's at Chris Morgan Sporkle. But again, if you want to contact me or something, if you're not on the Twitter or what have you, if you're curious about the book, or I do post stuff about the book on there, because even though I set it up for my trivia hosting, it's, my own personal Instagram. So I can, I put whatever I feel like on there. But yeah, so if you're interested in sort of like my writing of my idea, the book seems interesting to you, 99 episodes, that'd be, hopefully the book you buy first and foremost. Also, if you pre-order it, pre-orders are good for books. They're kind of like the most important thing apparently for like books these days in terms of like sales and getting out there. Yeah, I hear other writers say that, and like, it's like, oh, that's probably true, because they are notable writers working for big publications that like, yeah, pre-ordering a book such as it is good and appreciated. Be it, if you're not like an Amazon person, by all means, go to McFarlane Books, go to the Barnes & Noble website. Maybe you can have your local bookshop. I'll order a copy or two for you if you're interested. I hear people say that who are authors as well, so apparently that's an option. But yeah, 99 episodes that define the 90s. My upcoming book, I'm really happy with how it turned out. I'm also happy with my Nickelodeon book, how that turned out. I wrote a book about Mystery Science Theater 3000. That's a little out of date now because I wrote it before the show was rebooted. So literally the book begins with me saying some like line about how the show's like, been over for a while. The content's still good, but it is sort of like the thing where it's like when you write about culture these days, particularly TV, like, nothing really dies. So, sometimes something like that can happen. But, that book actually may be out of print at this point, TBH. But, if you can find a copy somewhere, and if you like Mystery Science 3000, I think the book turned out, reasonably well. It was my first one, but, 99 episodes to find the 90s. That's the, I'm calling to action, as they, say in a podcast advertising.
Yes.
If you pre-order 99 episodes that define the 90s by Chris Morgan, that would be very much appreciated on my part.
Yes. And I will make sure to include all of your links to your social media accounts, and to be able to pre-order the book. All that information will be in the show notes and also on my website. So definitely check it out, because it is a great book. I was able to access it in advance, and it was a really fun listen, and it was really hilarious because I had it on a PDF reader, so it was kind of like a robotic sort of Alexa sounding voice. He's probably going to turn on now downstairs, and even that was hysterical, and that was not even read. It was read by a very kind of monotone voice, and it was really funny and really engaging. And I listened to several chapters several times, so it's definitely a great read. Yeah, so it's a great read, highly recommend, and I think anybody who is a fan of this show will really enjoy that, because we've hit on a lot of the shows that you've talked about, and you get to learn about bizarro shows like Cop Rock, and I think it opens with Twin Peaks. So there's a lot of great material in there that I think people are really going to enjoy. So, Chris, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I hope you've enjoyed this look back on 90s TV shows with a special guest, author and pop culture lover and pop culture trivia host, Mr. Chris Morgan. I hope you will join me for my next show, where we will be discussing another fascinating facet of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Until then, be kind, be safe, and hold on to your memories.
Thank you for tuning in to my mama's podcast and the memories of Auntie Rebecca.